There are moments in life when we find ourselves walking a delicate borderland between desire and uncertainty, drawn towards someone who appears warm enough to stay close, yet distant enough to avoid commitment. Such a situation often awakens a conflict within the psyche, the part of us that longs for connection and the part of us that senses instability in the bond being offered. This tension is not simply about another person. It is, in the deeper sense, an encounter with the unconscious forces that shape our choices, our attachments, and our expectations of love. What appears on the surface as inconsistency in another is often a mirror of the unresolved patterns within ourselves. When someone enjoys your presence but resists commitment, the psyche is quietly inviting you to examine your own relationship with boundaries, self-worth, and desire. This is not a lesson of chasing, convincing, or bending yourself to fit the spaces someone leaves unfilled. It is an invitation to awaken to your own center, the inner self that knows its value beyond any external affirmation. Winning in such a situation does not mean altering another person's will. It means gaining mastery over your own inner landscape. It means turning the gaze inward, understanding why this dynamic evokes such intensity, why the unpredictability of another becomes a source of longing, and why fragments of affection feel like enough to keep you bound. The unconscious often attaches itself to partial love because it echoes stories we have not fully healed, stories of waiting, hoping, or trying to earn what should naturally flow. To win here is to become conscious. It is to recognize that the desire for a deeper bond should never lead you to shrink your own presence. When you stand firmly in your authenticity, when you speak with clarity rather than fear, when you allow your boundaries to rise from a place of self-respect instead of anxiety, something powerful happens. You shift the dynamic from one of emotional scarcity to one of psychological wholeness. And wholeness, in the Jungian sense, is always magnetic. When you stop trying to be chosen and instead choose yourself, the energy between you transforms. You become no longer someone who waits for another's readiness, but someone who lives from an inner readiness of their own. This is where the unconscious begins to reorganize itself. The fear of loss turns into the recognition of your own fullness. The desire to hold on to someone uncertain becomes the desire to hold on to yourself. And paradoxically, this is the moment when the dynamic changes in your favor. Presence becomes more attractive than pursuit. Confidence becomes more compelling than concession. And your clarity forces the other person to confront their own inner contradictions. Whether they rise to meet your energy or drift away, you remain rooted, a person who does not chase desire but embodies it. The truth is simple yet profound. When you align with your authentic self, you stop playing the role of someone waiting to be chosen. You become the one who chooses. And in the realm of human relationships, the one who is grounded in their own inner authority always holds the deeper power. Winning, then, is not about changing another person's intentions. It is about illuminating your own. It is about recognizing that the right connection does not require confusion, hesitation, or emotional half-measures. It flows with reciprocity, with resonance, with the natural harmony of two individuals meeting each other in the same place at the same depth. When someone wants your presence but not your commitment, the unconscious offers you a choice. Remain in the liminal space of uncertainty or step into the clarity of your own becoming. And when you choose the latter, you transform the dynamic entirely, not through persuasion, but through the unmistakable power of a person who knows their own worth and refuses to live at the edge of someone else's indecision. That is how you win. There are moments in the human experience when relationship dynamics do not simply unfold between two individuals, but instead reveal the deeper architecture of the psyche. When someone is drawn to another yet hesitates to fully commit, this outer situation becomes an inner landscape waiting to be explored. What appears as indecision or emotional inconsistency in the other is often a powerful mirror reflecting unfinished patterns, unspoken desires, and unconscious expectations that shape how one approaches love. The psyche does not act randomly. It presents situations that echo the unresolved stories within us, stories carried from past connections, childhood imprints, or projections that we have not yet recognized. The individual who finds themselves entangled in a relationship marked by ambiguity is not weak or misguided. Rather, they are standing at a symbolic crossroads where the unconscious is asking to be understood more deeply. To comprehend why such a dynamic holds emotional weight, one must step away from blaming the other person or themselves. Instead, the essential question becomes, what inner movement brought me to this point, and what is it trying to reveal? Jung often emphasized that what attracts us, frustrates us, or confuses us is usually tied to the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains pieces of ourselves we have not fully claimed. When someone wants closeness but avoids depth, the tension created between desire and distance may activate elements of the shadow, such as the longing for recognition, the fear of abandonment, or the hope that affection can be earned through patience or loyalty. This does not mean these desires are flawed. It means they are unintegrated, lingering beneath conscious awareness, influencing choices without being fully understood. The unconscious uses relationships as symbolic stages where old patterns replay, not to punish, but to offer the chance for consciousness to expand. This dynamic often reveals the subtle ways in which one has been conditioned to accept partial attention, inconsistent affection, or emotional unpredictability. Perhaps in earlier experiences, love was presented as something uncertain, something that required effort to maintain, or something that demanded emotional endurance. When these imprints remain unexamined, the psyche gravitates towards similar patterns unconsciously, not because they are healthy, but because they are familiar. The familiar is comfortable to the unconscious, even when it causes discomfort to the conscious self. By recognizing this pattern, one begins to understand that the situation is not merely about the other's unwillingness to commit, but about one's own internal blueprint of love, connection, and worth. Exploring this inner blueprint requires honesty. It requires the courage to look at why ambiguity can feel magnetic, why emotional inconsistency can intensify longing rather than diminish it, and why someone offering partial presence can feel more captivating than someone offering full availability. Jung believed that the unconscious often binds itself to symbolic figures who carry qualities we have not yet awakened within ourselves. For example, someone who fears their own independence may be drawn to another who remains emotionally unavailable, using the dynamic as a way to avoid confronting their own strength. Another person may seek commitment from someone reluctant to give it because deep down they are still wrestling with their own doubts about intimacy. The psyche externalizes what it has not resolved internally, enabling the individual to interact with their inner conflicts through the presence of another person. The mirror effect becomes especially clear when one observes their emotional reactions. Why does uncertainty trigger attachment instead of distance? Why does the possibility of connection overshadow the reality of mixed signals? These emotional responses often reveal the wounds and unmet needs that linger beneath the surface. The psyche is attempting to complete an old story, perhaps the story of not feeling prioritized, of not being chosen, or of believing that love must be earned rather than naturally reciprocated. In this way, the relationship dynamic becomes an invitation to move toward greater self-awareness rather than self-blame. The goal is not to intellectualize the situation, but to feel into the symbolic meaning behind it, recognizing that the unconscious is guiding the individual toward the parts of themselves that require healing or maturation. Recognizing the dynamic as a mirror is the first step in transforming it. When one stops focusing solely on whether the other person will change, commit, or deepen their engagement, the spotlight shifts inward. This inward gaze is not self-centered but self-liberating. It reveals the deeper truth. The power to reshape the experience lies not in controlling the external situation, but in illuminating the internal one. Jungian growth emerges from this encounter with the unconscious, from observing the patterns without judgment, and gradually reclaiming the parts of oneself that were projected onto another. This recognition begins to loosen the emotional intensity, because what once felt like a personal rejection now appears as an archetypal pattern, playing out in the psyche. As awareness grows, the individual begins to understand that the other person's uncertainty is not a reflection of their worth. It is simply an expression of the other's own psychological state, shaped by their history, fears, desires, and limitations. By separating one's identity from another's behavior, one begins to reclaim emotional autonomy. This shift is profound because it breaks the cycle of seeking validation from a dynamic that itself lacks clarity. It allows the individual to see the connection for what it is, a moment in time that has surfaced to reveal something deeper within themselves. This recognition opens the door to self-compassion. Instead of feeling compelled to fix, chase, or prove oneself, one begins to observe the emotional pull with curiosity. One becomes aware of how much energy is invested in trying to interpret mixed signals or in hoping for potential. This awareness does not diminish feelings, rather, it brings them into consciousness, where they can be understood instead of blindly followed. In this conscious state, the individual becomes capable of choosing differently, not from fear of loss, but from understanding of self. Through this inward journey, the dynamic becomes less about gaining commitment and more about gaining insight. The relationship, even in its uncertainty, serves as a psychological teacher, guiding the individual toward a deeper understanding of their patterns, their desires, and their unhealed places. And, as the unconscious becomes conscious, the individual's relationship to themselves begins to shift. They become more grounded, more aware, and more aligned with their true nature. And in this alignment, they no longer feel compelled to accept ambiguity as the price of connection, because they have recognized the value of their own inner clarity and emotional truth. To establish inner clarity and boundaries that reflect genuine self-worth, one must turn inward to confront the psychic forces that shape how they show up in relationships. Boundaries are not merely rules one sets with another person. They are expressions of the inner architecture of the self, the psychological scaffolding that reveals how deeply an individual has integrated their own value. Jung taught that the outer world consistently mirrors the inner state, and nowhere is this more evident than in the ways people allow or restrict access to their emotional world. When someone finds themselves accepting uncertainty, inconsistency, or half-hearted connection, the psyche is signaling that something within them is still negotiating its place between longing and self-protection. It is not weakness, but a call for deeper understanding. Clarity begins with the recognition that one's emotional needs are not excessive, inconvenient, or negotiable, but fundamental expressions of the self. When the individual suppresses these needs out of fear of losing someone, they enter a psychological split, a division between the authentic self and the adaptive self. The adaptive self emerges from past experiences, formed in environments where expressing needs felt risky or unwelcome. Over time, this adaptation can become so ingrained that one no longer questions why they tolerate ambivalence from others, why they silence their truth to preserve a connection, or why they fear that asserting their worth will cause disconnection. The psyche quietly endures what the conscious mind rationalizes, but the tension accumulates beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. To restore clarity, one must listen to the messages of this inner tension. The discomfort felt in situations where someone wants companionship but avoids commitment is the psyche's way of signaling that something is out of alignment. This discomfort is not an enemy but a guide. It reveals the gap between what the heart desires and what the situation currently offers. Jung believed that conflicts of this kind are attempts by the deeper self to draw attention to neglected inner truths. When clarity is absent, one drifts in emotional ambiguity, reacting to external behaviors rather than responding from inner knowing. But clarity returns when one dares to ask themselves what they truly want, independent of what the other is willing to give. This inner inquiry requires honesty, an honesty that penetrates beyond hopes and fantasies, beyond the stories the mind tells to avoid pain. It asks, what do I genuinely feel? What do I need to feel secure, valued, and respected? What am I afraid of losing by expressing my truth? And what part of me still believes that my desires must be molded around the limitations of another? These questions illuminate the places where self-worth has dimmed, where boundaries have softened, where the adaptive self has taken precedence over the authentic one. By confronting these questions, clarity begins to crystallize, not as a harsh judgment, but as a gentle unveiling of inner truth. Boundaries, in this context, become not walls but expressions of psychological integrity. They are the natural result of self-understanding, not the defensive reaction of fear. A person with authentic boundaries does not demand or control. They simply state what aligns with their inner truth. They do not plead for respect. They embody it. They do not fear being alone. They fear abandoning themselves. Such boundaries are anchored in self-worth, which itself emerges from the recognition that one's emotional needs are worthy of being met. This worth does not come from others' validation, but from the deep realization that the self has inherent value, independent of external approval. When clarity and boundaries merge, the individual becomes capable of interacting with uncertainty from a grounded place. Instead of clinging to mixed signals or trying to interpret the subtle gestures of another, they return to their own center and ask whether the situation aligns with their truth. If it does not, they do not force alignment or chase potential. They step back, not out of coldness, but out of respect for their psychological equilibrium. This step back is not an attempt to manipulate outcomes. It is the natural expression of someone who has integrated self-worth deeply enough to refuse emotional half-presence. From a Jungian perspective, such boundaries mark a significant step in individuation, the process of becoming one's true self. Individuation requires shedding the layers of conditioning that taught one to accept less than what they need. It demands confronting the inner voices that whisper fears of rejection, abandonment, or inadequacy. These inner voices are remnants of earlier experiences, shadows of old wounds that once shaped behavior. But as these shadows are illuminated, they lose their power to dictate responses. The individual no longer tolerates emotional ambiguity, simply because it feels familiar. They begin to seek resonance instead of fragments, reciprocity instead of pursuit, depth instead of distraction. As clarity strengthens, interactions with others take on a different tone. One no longer approaches relationships from a place of emotional hunger, hoping the other will fill a void. Instead, they engage from fullness, from an inner space that is already anchored. This groundedness alters the dynamic without effort. The individual who once feared expressing their needs now does so naturally, not to demand more, but simply to remain aligned with their truth. If the other person cannot meet these needs, the individual does not collapse inward. They accept the reality and protect their emotional integrity, understanding that staying true to oneself is more important than holding on to someone who cannot meet them at the same depth. This form of clarity is transformative. It shifts the individual from a reactive stance to a conscious one. No longer are they entangled in trying to decode the intentions or inconsistencies of another. They are rooted in their inner voice, which speaks more clearly than any mixed signal ever could. This voice guides them to what nurtures their growth and gently pulls them away from what keeps them emotionally stagnant. The boundary, then, becomes not a line drawn in defiance, but a natural consequence of self-realization. In this way, clarity and boundaries are not tools used against another person, but offerings made to the self. They honor the inner truth, protect the heart from imbalance, and create space for relationships that resonate with authenticity. They free the individual from chasing ambiguity and open the path to connections where presence, depth, and commitment arise naturally, without negotiation or compromise of the soul's integrity. Shifting from seeking validation to embodying authentic, grounded presence begins with an inner awakening, a quiet realization that worth is not something to be earned from another person but something already inherent within the self. In relationships marked by uncertainty or imbalance, the psyche often gravitates towards seeking reassurance, hoping for signs, gestures, or affirmations that confirm one's value. Yet this pursuit reflects an unconscious belief that one's significance depends on external approval, creating a psychological dependency that keeps the individual emotionally tethered to someone else's choices, moods, or level of interest. Jung observed that whenever we place the center of our identity outside ourselves, we lose contact with the inner source from which true strength arises, and thus we begin to act from a place of fragmentation rather than wholeness. Validation seeking is not a flaw but a symbol of deeper wounds, echoing past experiences where the self learned to prove its value, to be acknowledged or accepted. This pattern often emerges quietly, weaving itself into interactions without being noticed. One may wait for messages that never arrive, interpret small gestures as meaningful, or adjust behavior in subtle ways to maintain closeness with someone emotionally inconsistent. These actions are not conscious strategies but expressions of an old, unhealed story within the psyche. The story may whisper that love is conditional, that one must perform, adapt, or endure to be chosen. But beneath these whispers lies the unrealized truth that the desire for validation is simply the self longing to return to its own center, to be recognized by the one person who has overlooked it the most. oneself. When one turns inward and confronts this longing, something begins to shift. The search for external affirmation begins to lose its grip because the individual starts to see that validation is unreliable when it comes from a place of inconsistency or emotional distance. It becomes clear that seeking reassurance from someone who does not offer stability only deepens inner confusion. The psyche, in its wisdom, reveals that what is needed is not a sign from the outside, but a reconnection with the inner authority that defines one's worth. This shift is not sudden, it unfolds gradually as awareness grows. Each moment of discomfort, each instance of waiting, each pang of insecurity becomes a reminder that the true source of strength lies not beyond, but within. To embody grounded presence, one must learn to inhabit themselves fully, to stand in their truth without bending according to another's fluctuations. Grounded presence is the psychological state in which the self is aligned with its own values, desires, and emotional needs. It does not depend on whether the other person chooses, prioritizes, or commits. Instead, it emerges from the realization that one's identity and self-respect do not hinge on uncertain external dynamics. This presence radiates a quiet confidence, not born from pride, but from inner alignment. It says without words, "I know who I am, I know what I feel, and I do not abandon myself for the sake of being chosen." In this state, the individual no longer reacts impulsively to mixed signals or inconsistent behavior. Instead of overthinking or anxiously interpreting small gestures, they view them from a place of clarity. They see the situation not through the lens of longing, but through the lens of truth. This clarity allows them to participate in the connection without losing themselves within it. The relationship becomes a mirror rather than an anchor, reflecting not their worth but their growth. And from this position, they can decide consciously whether the dynamic nurtures them or diminishes them. Authentic presence also dissolves the compulsion to prove oneself. There is no need to demonstrate patience in hopes of earning love, no need to minimize needs to avoid appearing demanding, no need to act as a source of comfort when the other is inconsistent. Instead, the self expresses what it feels without fear of destabilizing the connection. The psyche recognizes that truth spoken from groundedness is not an ultimatum but a reflection of inner wholeness. When one expresses themselves from this place, they do so without attachment to outcome. They share their needs, boundaries, and emotions because they honor themselves, not because they hope the other will finally choose them. This transformation often surprises the unconscious, which has grown accustomed to old patterns of adaptation, but it also liberates it. Jung believed that the unconscious seeks integration, not repetition. When the individual stops chasing validation and begins embodying authenticity, the psyche experiences a return of energy, as if reclaiming power once scattered across the actions, hopes, and fears directed toward another. The self becomes more coherent, more rooted, and more aligned with its true nature. This alignment naturally shifts the dynamic of the relationship because the individual's energy changes. They are no longer someone trying to earn affection. They are someone who knows they deserve a connection that reflects mutual clarity and depth. Embodying grounded presence also reveals the difference between desire and attachment. Desire flows naturally, expressing itself without fear. Attachment clings, seeking security from uncertain sources. When grounded, one can desire connection without becoming entangled in it. They can enjoy moments without turning them into expectations. They can appreciate intimacy without imagining that temporary closeness equals long-term commitment. This freedom allows the individual to stay emotionally open yet psychologically anchored. They remain connected to their inner truth even in the presence of someone who is uncertain. As this presence strengthens, the need for validation withers. The individual begins to feel a calmness that does not depend on anyone else's choices. They begin to trust themselves more deeply, knowing they can navigate emotional landscapes without losing their equilibrium. They begin to see that true power is not in being wanted, but in being aligned with their own worth. And in this alignment, something paradoxical often occurs. The more they embody themselves, the more compelling they become. Their energy shifts from pursuit to presence, from hoping to knowing. This shift can draw others closer, but even if it does not, the individual remains whole. Ultimately, the journey from seeking validation to embodying grounded presence is an inner transformation. a movement from unconscious patterns to conscious selfhood. It is a reclamation of identity, a recognition of intrinsic value, and a return to the core of one's being. It is the moment when the self no longer looks outward for proof of its worth, but inward for the truth that has always been there. And once this truth is embodied, the individual becomes capable of engaging in relationships with clarity, strength, and authenticity, without sacrificing themselves for the sake of belonging. Letting your centeredness transform the dynamic, choosing yourself rather than waiting to be chosen, is a profound psychological shift that arises when the self finally recognizes its own authority. In relationships where ambiguity dominates and emotional reciprocity feels uncertain, the instinct is often to wait, to hope, to anticipate some moment in which the other person finally awakens to the depth and sincerity of your presence. Yet this waiting creates a subtle distortion of the psyche, as the self moves away from its own center and hovers anxiously around another person's decisions, desires, or timing. Jung observed that whenever we orbit around someone else's will, we lose contact with the inner guiding force that anchors us to our individuality. Choosing oneself, then, is not an act of defiance, but an act of psychic realignment, a return to the axis around which your life is meant to turn. Centeredness is not a performance, but an internal state, arising from the integration of shadow, desire, fear, and inner truth. To be centered is to stand firmly within your own psychological space, unshaken by another's inconsistency or hesitation. It is the recognition that your emotional world deserves stability, presence, and reciprocity, and that you cannot build your sense of self on someone else's wavering energy. This centeredness is not coldness, it is rootedness. It is the quiet strength of someone who understands their worth so clearly that they no longer wait to be chosen but choose themselves, not as a final decision against the other, but as a continuous commitment to their own soul. The dynamic begins to transform the moment this inner shift occurs. Previously, emotional uncertainty may have created anxiety, doubt, or longing, pulling the psyche into patterns of overthinking or emotional chasing. But when the self becomes centered, the dynamic no longer activates the same psychological vulnerabilities. What once felt emotionally destabilizing now becomes something observed rather than absorbed. The individual begins to see the dynamic with clarity, recognizing not only what is being offered, but what is missing. This clarity does not create resentment, it creates understanding. And with understanding comes the quiet realization that no relationship can thrive on potential alone, and no heart can remain open indefinitely to a connection that is not willing to meet it with the same depth. Choosing oneself is not an act of walking away, but an act of walking inward. It is the moment when the self decides that its own emotional needs are not negotiable tokens waiting for someone else's approval. It is a return to the inner sanctuary, where identity, dignity, and emotional truth reside. This choice dismantles the internal dependency that once made the individual feel small or powerless in the presence of mixed signals. Instead of seeking clarity from another, they become the source of their own clarity. Instead of waiting for someone else's readiness, they honor their own. Jung taught that the most powerful transformations occur when the individual stops projecting their unmet needs onto another and takes responsibility for their own psychic fulfillment. Choosing oneself is the embodiment of this principle, and something remarkable happens when this choice is made. The energy that once flowed outward in longing begins to flow inward in strength. The need for validation begins to dissolve, replaced by the calm recognition that worth is inherent. The self no longer contracts in response to another's distance. It expands into its own presence. This expansion is not loud or dramatic, but subtle and deep, like a light returning to a room that had dimmed without being noticed. The individual becomes more grounded, more emotionally coherent, more attuned to their own rhythm. This groundedness naturally shifts how they show up in the dynamic. They are no longer shaped by the fear of loss, but guided by the desire for emotional truth. When the self is centered, it no longer negotiates with fragments. It no longer accepts partial affection or conditional attention. It no longer twists itself into forms that may be more convenient for someone else. It stands in its truth, not with rigidity but with quiet certainty. This certainty, paradoxically, is what often transforms the dynamic externally. The other person feels the shift. The energy becomes different. The individual is no longer seeking, waiting, or trying to hold the connection together alone. Their presence becomes stable, self-sustaining, and this stability carries a kind of magnetic force.